A to Z Mysteries, Book number 26, The Zombie Zone. Chapter 5. The man standing at the grave's edge was tall. He wore dark clothing. His face was in shadow, but his hair looked silver in the moonlight. Dink felt there was something familiar about him. The man wiped red clay from his pant legs. Then he shone the flashlight on his wrist, causing his watch to gleam briefly. He turned and disappeared into the trees. Who was that? Josh asked. It sure wasn't a zombie wearing a watch and carrying a flashlight, Ruth Rose said. I wonder what he was doing down in that grave, Dink said. Should we go look? No, Josh hissed. It's bad enough we're creeping around cemeteries. We're not crawling down into some grave. Let's go tell Jack, Ruth Rose said. The kids retraced their steps back to the campsite. Dink was relieved to see Jack's tall form lying in the hammock. Let's not wake him, Dink said. We can tell him in the morning. The kids tiptoed past Jack, then knelt to crawl into the tent. See anything interesting? Jack asked. All three kids jumped and whipped around. You're awake? Dink asked. Jack sat up in his hammock. I'm a light sleeper, he said. Where have you been? We need to talk to you, Ruth Rose said. We saw someone at the cemetery. You did? Jack jumped out of his hammock. He had put on dark sweat clothes. He pushed up his sleeve and looked at his watch. What were you doing at the cemetery at midnight? Something woke me up, Dink said. I noticed a light in the woods, and we decided to follow it. Dink stared at Jack. He couldn't help comparing him with the man they'd just seen at the graveyard. Both were tall, wearing dark clothing. Both had light hair and wore wristwatches. We saw a guy crawl out of a grave, Josh said. We know he wasn't a zombie because he was wearing a watch, right guys? Dink focused on Jack's face. Could it have been him they'd just spied on? What would Jack be doing in an empty grave? Do you think it could have been the grave robber? Asked Ruth Rose. Was he digging? Jack asked. We don't know, Josh said. We didn't see a shovel or anything. Josh pointed at Dink. He wanted to go down in it, but I said no way. You were smart, Jack told Josh. But you were all pretty foolish to go out in these woods without telling me. Don't do it again, okay? The kids nodded. Okay, but who do you think that was? Ruth Rose asked. Jack stretched and leaned against one of his hammock trees. My guess? One of the men from the village just checking out the cemetery. For all we know, they may have posted guards to make sure the grave robber doesn't steal anymore, he said. But what was he doing down in one of the graves? Josh asked. Jack shrugged. I have no idea, he admitted. Now, how about we get some sleep? Jack hoisted himself back into his hammock. The kids crawled into the tent, and Dink zipped it shut. After they were settled, Dink lay on his back staring at the tent ceiling. He tried to remember if he'd taken a good look at Jack's hammock before they'd followed the flashlight. Dink didn't know for sure if Jack had been there when they'd left. Dink tried to swallow, but his mouth had gone dry. Could the grave robber have been sleeping in a hammock just outside their tent? Dink didn't sleep well that night. Chapter 6. Dink woke up when he heard someone singing outside the tent. He peeked out and saw Jack opening the coolers. Sunlight slanted across the water, turning the gulf to gold. A sweet-smelling breeze came with the sun. It was a perfect morning, and Dink was hungry. As Dink pulled on his sneakers, he thought of last night. He laughed. No way could that have been Jack in the grave. No way. Dink nudged Josh and Ruth Rose awake, then unzipped the flap and left the tent. Jack was wearing shorts and a t-shirt again. "Hey," he said, smiling at Dink. "I brought fruit and bagels and juice. You hungry?" "Yeah, my stomach is rumbling," Dink said. "Mine is too," Josh said, joining them. Ruth Rose came next, fixing her headband. Jack carried the food down to one of the flat-bottomed boats to use it as a tabletop. They looked out over the water as they ate. "Look," Jack said, pointing along the shore. A mother squirrel and two young ones were sitting at the water's edge. They washed their hands and faces, then waddled back into the trees. "When are we going to see the alligator nest?" Josh asked. Jack checked his watch. "Pretty soon, but I want to check in on Myrna first. Do you mind?" he asked. "She seemed worried yesterday." "Sure," Dink said. "But what will we do with the tent and stuff?" "I'll get it later," Jack said. "Are you going to tell Myrna what we saw last night?" asked Ruth Rose. Jack chewed his lower lip for a few seconds. "If I'm right and it was one of the village men, she'd already know about it," he said. "But I'll definitely mention it to her." The kids helped Jack tidy up. Then they hiked toward the small village. Myrna was there, weeding her garden. Myrna looked up at Jack. "Everyone is at the graveyard," she said. "I came to see how you're doing," Jack told her. Myrna sat on the edge of her porch. She stretched her back and wiped dirt from her hands. "My friend Bo wants to leave here. One of the robbed graves is his father's." She glanced up at Jack. "I am worried too." Just then, Jack's cell phone rang. He answered, listened, then said, "Okay, hon, see you in a few minutes." "Is the baby coming?" asked Dink. "I don't know, but my wife said she feels funny," Jack said. "She wants to go see her doctor. Do you mind if I take you back to the hotel for a while? I'll pick you up later and we can check out that alligator nest." "They can stay with me," Myrna offered. "Go see your wife. The kids will be fine here until you get back." "Is that okay with you guys?" Jack asked. "Sure," Ruth Rose said. "But will you let my grandmother know? She keeps her cell phone with her while she's painting." Jack nodded. "I'll call her from the van," she said. He took off jogging back toward the trail. "See you in an hour," he called over his shoulder. "I better finish this weeding," Myrna said. She hiked her dress up and got down on her knees in the garden. The bottoms of her feet were black from the rich soil. "Myrna, did one of the men go out to guard the cemetery last night?" Dink asked. The woman sat back. "Why are you asking?" Jack was going to ask you, but he forgot," Dink said. Myrna shook her head. "I don't know. Listen, while I work on the garden, why don't you kids go out and explore?" she said. "What if we get lost?" Josh asked. "Then I'll come get you," Myrna said, reaching into a deep pocket and pulling out a whistle on a lanyard. "My grandkids use this when they come to visit me," she said, dropping the lanyard around Josh's neck. "Don't your grandchildren live here?" Dink asked. Myrna shook her head. "My son took his family and moved away," she said, gazing at her simple hut. Myrna yanked a weed from in between some clumps of lettuce. "Go play for a while," she said. The kids left Myrna and walked the edge of the clearing. "I want to go back to the cemetery," Ruth Rose said. "Yuck, why?" Josh asked. "Aren't you curious?" Ruth Rose asked. "Or do you believe we saw a zombie last night?" "I don't know and I don't care," Josh said. "That totally creeped me out." "Oh, come on, Josh," Dink said. "Now that it's daylight, we might find a clue to who was down in that grave." "Okay, I'll go, but don't try to get me to climb down in it," Josh said. The kids found the path to the graveyard. When they got there, they saw dozens of village people on their knees near the 2 empty graves. Their heads were bowed, and no one was saying a word. "I think they're praying," Dink whispered. "Let's keep going." They moved quietly away, following the iron fence. They came to the beginning of another narrow path, opposite the one that led back to Myrna's hut. Josh peered down the path. He was holding onto Myrna's whistle with one hand. "What's down there?" he asked nervously. "That's what we're going to find out," Ruth Rose said. They walked single file. Ruth Rose led, and Josh hiked right behind her, which was why he nearly walked up her heels when she suddenly stopped. "What?" Dink asked when he was standing next to Ruth Rose. Ruth Rose didn't say anything. She was pointing to the ground. Then Dink and Josh saw it too. Ruth Rose had spotted a large footprint in the moist red clay. "Oh my gosh," Josh moaned. "Zombie feet."